So now we're in the, sixth part of this Alexander's the Conquest series by Kings and Generals about the Siege of Gaza. And man, Egypt is an interesting place and how many great conquerors show up there, from Alexander to Julius Caesar to Napoleon. Like, something about Egypt, man. It's even ancient to these guys, and it's definitely one of the oldest civilizations in the world, rich in history and just, cultural significance. So it's always interesting that it keeps popping up in these videos. I don't know. I just think it's really cool.
In our previous episode on Alexander the Great and his conquests, we detailed the Macedonian king's dramatic siege of the defiant Phoenician city of Tyre in 332. Through bravery, doggedness, and a generous quantity of engineering genius, the invaders broke the walls and took the island, joining it with the mainland forever in the process. Rather than push inland in pursuit of the great king of Persia, Alexander would instead march south to the most ancient kingdom in the Hellenic imagination, Egypt. There, the Macedonian king would begin work on one of the most enduring marvels of his life and endure events that were to change his perspective on life forever. Welcome to our 6th video covering the Macedonian invasion of Persia, the conquest of Egypt, and how Alexander visited the famous desert oracle at Siwa. Following the capture and destruction of Tyre in July of 332 BC, Alexander the Great had once more rejected generous peace overtures from Darius III, famously quipping, "That is what I should do were I Parmenion," hitting out at the underwhelming ambition of his right-hand man. The king didn't just want accommodation or riches now, he wanted the entirety of the Persian Empire and perhaps beyond. The next objective—
I like that little, call out on Parmenion. I don't know. That's funny.
was to the south, Egypt. As the Macedonian army, victorious in 5 major clashes since crossing into Asia, rushed into Palestine, it received the immediate surrender of every city in the region except one. That single defiant was Gaza, a formidable hilltop stronghold controlling the approaches to Egypt. Like Tyre, it too would have to be taken. Unfortunately for Alexander, Gaza's Persian governor Batis had been proactive during the siege on Tyre, taking the measure of hiring Arab mercenaries and stocking up his city with plentiful stores to withstand a siege of his own domain. The 160-mile march south through Phoenicia and Palestine was a harsh one, despite the lack of conflict. Refreshment was hard to come by, and the climate, during the Near Eastern summer, was incredibly—
So there's Jerusalem. Like I said, I've mentioned on and off again that I went to Bible school theology, and there's actually some sources talking about Alexander's visit to Jerusalem, that he actually asked, that they originally had not completely sided with him, and that he had threatened that he would go there himself to, basically attack the city. But, in the religious writings, that apparently the high priest at the time had gotten, a message from God to go out and actually meet Alexander. And when Alexander showed up, he actually, in a way, I'm not sure it was prostrate, but he showed respect towards the insignia that the high priests of the Jews, bore as representation of God. And Alexander stating that he had a dream regarding the high priest. And then Alexander actually offered sacrifices there at Jerusalem, and he was shown the scriptures, mainly the book of Daniel, which actually gives prophecy about how the Greeks would, conquer the Persians. It's actually in the Bible, in the book of Daniel. And, wait, let me show you. Yeah, so it's in the book of Daniel, around chapter 8 through 10, kind of gives the symbolic prophecy regarding the Greek Empire. mainly told through the representation of a ram and a goat, the ram representing the Medo-Persians, while the goat that came from the west, as said in Daniel 8, had a single horn between its eyes that was supposed to kind of represent Alexander, and eventually that horn broke off, kind of alluding to Alexander's untimely death, and, it also gives prophecy that his empire, the Greek Empire, would fracture. So, that's interesting. Also, there was a dream from King Nebuchadnezzar of a great statue. You might have seen it, and that each statue part represents a certain, different kingdom. And that the Greek kingdom was represented through bronze, and the Roman kingdom that came after it was iron. Again, I usually don't talk about religion, but I feel like it's kind of interesting to give a religious perspective of Alexander, even if you don't believe in it. I don't know, I think it's interesting. I mean, obviously I believe in it, because, I'm Christian, but, I don't know, maybe just in a way you can see it through a theological Christian perspective, that it's almost Alexander was destined to succeed, but also die young, I don't know. I think it's interesting, and yeah, Alexander read the prophecy, and he apparently, as the writing goes, when he visited Jerusalem, he got the writing, and he was ecstatic. He was like, "Yeah, I'm the guy who's going to conquer the Persians as it's foretold," and I think that's why, he didn't destroy Jerusalem. At least that's how the writing goes. Wait. Yeah, so that account that I just recited to all of you and told you about was written by a historian named Flavius Josephus, he was a Roman / Jewish historian. So you can definitely read it. Just look up Alexander Visits Jerusalem by Flavius Josephus. Like, you can actually read it online for free. It's a really interesting read, So yeah, we should probably get back to this video, huh?
Arid. The army's salvation was the fleet element, commanded by Alexander's closest companion, Hephaestion, which kept the advancing soldiers supplied with food and water. Acre, known during the Crusades as Acre, was passed first, followed by Joppa and Ascalon. This simple progress finally came to a swift halt when Gaza loomed large on the horizon in September of 332 BC. Alexander's army took up position opposite a section of the fortification on the southern side of the city, which the Macedonians considered weakest. Aiming to take advantage of subterfuge, the king ordered his engineers to begin mining beneath the Gazan walls, but to begin their work from far out of sight. At the same time, siege towers were ordered forward to distract Battus's garrison from the true threat beneath the soft earth. Due to the sandy and easily excavated ground surrounding Gaza, sapping operations progressed rapidly. However, the siege towers had massive trouble rolling along such uneven hilly terrain due to the sand, which would frequently trap the wheels and cause delays. Constant jarring of this kind eventually caused the flooring within the towers to break apart, injuring soldiers and making further approach impossible. Reluctantly, as the sun was already close to setting, Alexander decreed that the army halt their assault for the evening. After an uneventful night, before operations commenced, the king made a traditional sacrifice asking for the gods' aid. While the ritual was ongoing, it is said that a crow flew overhead and dropped a lump of dry mud on Alexander's head before taking a perch on the nearest siege tower, and this was viewed as a grim omen by the soldiery and their monarch. Alexander consulted his personal soothsayer, Aristander, who interpreted the event to foretell the fall of the city, but also harm that would come to Alexander during the clash. He recommended that the army take no action that day, and as a sign of just how superstitious Alexander was, the king acquiesced. Deciding the passivity of their foes to be a sign of weakness, Battus's mercenary Arab troops launched a brazen sortie out of the city gates in an attempt to destroy Alexander's siege towers and kill as many Macedonians as they could. Having taken the first of the enemy soldiers by surprise, Battus's Arabs initially met with some success and reached the towers with relatively little struggle. However, when Alexander caught on to what exactly was happening, he led his companions and hypaspists into battle from the front line, crashing into the spot where the fighting was fiercest. This decisive intervention stabilized the engagement and tipped the momentum towards the Macedonians. But the king was not going to escape unscathed, as the soothsayer had predicted. Quintus Curtius Rufus tells us of how one of Battus's hired swords pretended to be a deserter and threw himself before the king, asking for pardon. Alexander, always magnanimous, told the man to rise and be received. Thus able to get close, the Arab suddenly retrieved his sword and lunged at the king's neck. With athletic prowess, Alexander shifted to the side, avoiding the lethal blow, only to be wounded by an arrow in the shoulder almost immediately.
So I bought a $500 ball.
The Macedonians shoved the Gazan defenders back inside the city. However, they retreated in high spirits, their morale buoyed by the Macedonian commander's apparent severe injury or death on the battlefield. Somewhat.
Dang, dude. Alexander, I had heard Alexander's taken injuries. Yeah, you know, from various places, from the chest, head, neck. You know, Alexander, even in his speech to his mutinous army, that he said, you know, I've been injured by every type of weapon. Like, the dude's tough, you know, to take so much damage and just to keep going. Like, he really was like a different breed of man, you know what I mean? Like, the guy just rocks.
Less to their liking, Alexander too was, despite his terrible wound, incredibly happy. Aristander had been correct. Harm had come to him, of course, but now the other prediction, that Gaza would soon fall, would surely come to pass. While the king recovered from yet another near miss that might have ended his life, he commanded his army to begin yet another monumental feat of engineering. In an arc around Alexander's siege lines, the earth was piled up and up over the course of several weeks until it created a mound that was as high as the escarpment on which the city sat. Onto that encircling artificial hillock was placed the heaviest Macedonian artillery that now could unleash devastating missiles from its new higher position. It was now October. 2 months after the king's initial investment of the city, he launched a withering bombardment from the mound, which cracked open a portion of the city walls and allowed his elites to breach them.
I love watching Alexander's siege work because it really is. No one really talks much about Alexander's siege work, but it is really great. The guy is really good at this stuff, and he's very creative. I haven't seen this kind of creative siege work since Julius Caesar, you know? Like, Alexander he really is amazing. You know, as just a commander and leader. Like I said, I'm like in awe of him this entire series, you know?
Despite fearsome resistance, Alexander's army was not to be denied its prize. Gaza was taken, looted, and its male population wiped out, while
after the siege, Battus refused to submit to Alexander. With extreme rage, Alexander tied his legs with a rope behind a chariot and dragged his body around the wall of Gaza, torturing him to death. Holy crap. Very Achilles and Hector-like, but at least when Achilles did it, Hector was already dead. You know, Alexander did this when he was alive. At least that's what I'm getting. Dang. Again, man, like, Alexander was known for his rages and his hot temper, you know?
Women and children were sold as slaves. Alexander finally crossed into Egypt now that the way was clear, reaching the gateway to the Nile, Pelusium, in just a week. When he and his army arrived, they were met not by a dogged garrison of defenders, but by a cheering crowd of overjoyed people who regarded the invading Macedonians as liberators. As the Romans would in a later age, the Persians had treated Egypt as an exploitable breadbasket for centuries, ruthlessly crushing unrest and suppressing the native religion. The Egyptians, in turn, reviled the Persians. The Achaemenid governor, Mesekes, realized his unstable position and received Alexander with friendship, granting the king open access to Egypt and its treasuries. From Pelusium, Alexander sailed up the Nile to Memphis, the ancient capital of the Nile kingdom in its days of strength. In contrast to the first Achaemenid conqueror of Egypt, Cambyses, who is said to have profaned the divine Apis, Alexander showed himself as a friend by offering the god special sacrifice. Then, on November 14, 332, the priesthood at Memphis placed the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, symbol of the pharaohs, onto Alexander's head and gave him the traditional scepter and flail. The ruler of Macedon was now also pharaoh of Egypt, god and king all at once, son of Ra and Osiris, Horus the Golden One, beloved of Amen. For a man who had always been curious about his potentially divine origins, given the words of his mother Olympias.
Yeah, I've heard of Olympias apparently claimed, like, Alexander, I think they believe he was descended from Achilles, and, I think even at points I think Alexander did claim, or someone claimed that he was the son of Zeus, which apparently the Macedonians were like, dude, we knew Philip. We knew your dad. We know your dad. Like, you can't claim that. But, and this is kind of a point of contention, I think, the beginning of it, because Alexander obviously wanted to integrate all these different cultures into his kingdom, his empire, and again, the Greeks were xenophobic, right? So Alexander was trying to be everything to everyone, but the Greeks weren't having it, and like, when he gets to conquering the Persians, he starts dressing like a Persian, demanding to be basically worshipped and revered as the Persian emperors, and some of the Macedonians were like, what? Like, excuse me? They weren't happy with that new behavior, and I think it began here, being the son of a god, divine, the way they were seeing him. And obviously Alexander's already huge ego was like, dude, I am a god, or basically I am divine. And then like it's starting, that big ego, as we know, will go on to cause a lot of tension between him and his fellow Greeks. Yeah, and then there's Ptolemy in the corner like, I can't wait to take it all and start my incest dynasty, like I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Let's get back to the video.
The impact of this latest enthronement can hardly be understated. The new pharaoh departed Memphis in January of 331, sailing towards the Mediterranean until he reached Lake Merotis. There, inspired by the quality of the site opposite the island of Pharos, Alexander ordered that planning and construction efforts on a new city begin immediately.
Let me guess, Alexandria? Didn't Alexander name, like, almost a good portion of the cities he conquered after himself? Like Alexandria, there was like 20 of those. But yeah, the famous Library of Alexandria, which would go on to be a hub of great knowledge in the ancient world, can't be overstated,
So enthusiastic was Alexander about this new project that he supposedly designated the layout of the town and the limit of its defenses himself. That city would, over the next few decades, become Alexandria, the cosmopolitan capital of the ancient world. While his architects and laborers continued preparatory work on the new Greece-facing city, Alexander found himself consumed by a sudden desire to visit a famous oracle of the god Zeus Ammon. This religious figure had previously been consulted by King Croesus of Lydia, Athens during the Peloponnesian War, and many other historical giants. It was seen with equal reverence to the oracle at Delphi. The problem was that this oracle resided within a desert oasis known as Siwa, fully 300 miles distant to the west. Alexander no doubt wished to discover more about his divine parentage, and the Siwa oracle was the perfect place to receive this godly information, given that the Egyptian Amen and Greek Zeus were generally viewed as different interpretations of the same god. It is said that during a war among the gods long ago, the Hellenic pantheon transformed into animals and fled to Egypt. Aphrodite, for example, was said to be Isis under another name. Other less esoteric motivations were also present. A crucial stage of the campaign against Persia was upcoming, and divine backing would be a great boon. Setting out in late
Look at Ptolemy right there. He's like, I'm really liking this place. I might take it later. I'm sorry. Every time I hear the name Ptolemy, I just think of the freaking Ptolemy family and what a mess that was. The incest dynasty, as they call it. I mean, granted, incest was in a lot of dynasties. It's just like the Ptolemies took it to another level, you know?
January with only a small band, among whom was the future Egyptian ruler Ptolemy. Alexander travelled 170 miles west along the coastal road and eventually reached the small settlement of Peritonium on the borders of Cyrenaica. There, the adventuring king received a delegation of emissaries from Kyrene. They granted him a number of grandiose gifts, including fine horses and chariots, and he concluded a treaty of peace and alliance with them. The party then continued on their way, turning inland from the Mediterranean. What followed was a grueling slog through the parched, desolate, and utterly inhospitable Libyan desert. The band's water supplies ran out 4 days into the venture, but they were saved by a great rainstorm that came just at the right time. Not content with just dehydrating the Macedonians, the desert then saw fit to disorient them as well. Khamsin desert winds picked up, blasting away all landmarks in a withering sandstorm that made Alexander's guides lose their bearings. Finally, almost a month after setting out from Lake Merotis, the party managed to follow a flight of birds to the verdant Siwa oasis, which they reached in late February 331. While the group remained behind and enjoyed the relative luxury of the oasis, Alexander went directly to the temple. The head priest, waiting for him, addressed the king as Son of Amen, good God, Lord of the two lands, and then ushered him inside. As Arrian puts it, Alexander then put his question to the oracle and received the answer which his heart desired. Since not a single person, except Alexander, was permitted entry, nobody truly knows what the king heard in that temple, but whatever it was left an irrevocable and permanent impact on him. Plutarch, writing almost half a millennia later, tells us that Alexander, upon gaining entry, asked the oracle whether or not the murderers of his father had been punished for their crime. To this, the oracle responded that the king ought to guard his tongue, since his father was indeed immortal and therefore could not die. The implication is quite clear. Alexander the Great was the son of Zeus Amen, and therefore a divine being in his own right. There are several other tales in the ancient sources concerning this consultation, but they are likely also speculation. Sometime after entering, Alexander exited the temple and was met by his companions, to whom he would tell none of the details about what had been revealed to him. After rewarding the Siwa shrine with plentiful gifts of gold, the party returned.
Okay, let the famous historian EDJ, writing over 2,000 years after this, tell you what actually happened. Alexander walked in there and he asked, "Hey, am I a god?" And then the priest, knowing that Alexander would kill him if he didn't say yes, proceeded to hype him up, building up his ego to the point Alexander was like, "I am a god." And then he walked out happily and thought he was deserving of worship and praise. Bam. Solved it. Listen to my account. Forget Plutarch. Forget everyone else. I'm the guy you should be listening to. I'm the historian you should all be listening to. Alright, let's get back to this.
To the embryonic city of Alexandria by the route they had come. The first indications of spring were now upon the Macedonians. After the relatively simple foray into Egypt, it was nearly time to resume the campaign against Darius III. Before the Titans locked horns again, however, there were important administrative matters to conclude. Leaving the great work at Alexandria in the capable hands of his builders, engineers, and architects, Alexander sailed south to Memphis, where he was once again infatuated by the ancient city's air of quasi-divine pharaonic majesty. The monarch was fawned on by his Egyptian subjects as though he was a deity on earth, and artists began depicting their new beloved ruler on temple walls across the country. Peter Green implies that Greek emissaries actually began to understand Alexander's change in personality and a newfound love for Oriental divinity, realizing that it could be exploited for their own ends. Several embassies of Greeks were waiting for the king at Memphis with petitions, all of which, Arrian tells us, were generously granted. It is tempting to say that their flattery might have swayed the king, but it is equally possible that a mix of success and elation at the Siwa revelation had Alexander in a good mood. Beyond mere emotion, Alexander also had a more pragmatic motivation to begin treating the Greeks more gently at the beginning of 331. As feared, Persian assistance had allowed Sparta's king Agis III to start making trouble at home. Throughout Alexander's time in Egypt, Agis had managed to take over most of Crete and stood poised to attack the mainland with a large mercenary force. The situation was a volatile tinderbox just waiting to be lit, and being unduly harsh to other Greek states seemed likely to make the situation explode more violently. Alexander paid special attention to the governance of Egypt, which he immediately viewed as both a plentiful cornucopia and a potential threat. It had presented two primary threats to occupying empires in the past: nationalist rebellions by disaffected natives and attempts by devious governors to leverage Egypt's supreme strength in revolt against the larger empire. The king now set out a number of reforms, aimed at avoiding both of these nightmare scenarios. He separated the Nile Kingdom's administration into civil and military branches. Routine day-to-day bureaucracy remained in the hands of local Egyptians, a move which gained Alexander the favor of the locals. Not only that, but if those same bureaucrats began making a mess of things, the population wouldn't blame him. The traditional geographical division of Upper and Lower Egypt.
Okay. Nomarchs, great chief in Greek, or as the Egyptians called them, were provisional governors in Egypt. The practice started at least 3,000 years before Alexander arrived in Egypt.
Was also employed, with a district governor known as a nomarch serving as steward over each segment. Geographical divide and rule tactics of this kind were also used on the military front, although Greeks were employed rather than Egyptians. The country's eastern and western districts would be commanded by Cleomenes of Naucratis and Apollonius, son of Carinus, respectively. Macedonian garrison commanders were also instituted at Memphis and Pelusium in order to keep order in the delicate, fertile, and often revolt-prone breadbasket that was Egypt. With matters of governance finalized, Alexander took his whole army back north to Tyre. In the Achaemenid heartland, Darius had been using the time since his defeat at Issus to gather a fresh, even more numerous force to throw Alexander back. This army was made up of a multitude of peoples from every realm of Asia still under Persian control, including India, Scythia, and Bactria. Predominant among the Persian aristocracy was Bessus, governor of Bactria, who not only brought to bear a powerful force, but also possessed kingly ambitions. The stage was set, and the curtain was about to rise on the final great battle between Macedon and Persia, the Battle of Gaugamela. And our video on that battle is on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing, it helps immensely. Our video—
Heck yeah, that's awesome, and that video's tomorrow, the big battle at last. I can't wait, I'm actually really pumped, and I'll see you guys tomorrow when we get there. Bye everyone.